everyone to the last seminar in our spring series. And since the weather really improved now, I think it's fitting. It's summer now, so we come to an end with the spring series. I'm delighted to welcome Irina Dumitrescu, who's our speaker today. She's professor for medieval English literature at the University of Bonn. And she also writes creatively in all sorts of different genres, essays, criticism, a column. She's also producing a podcast with a colleague, and she is currently working on a book which engages with how medieval literature affects our thinking, her thinking, how it can influence us, how it can be meaningful for us today, or for her personal in particular. In her work in progress talk today, there will be a similar focus, which will be how medieval texts and modern writers can influence each other. And she will reflect on how coming from a creative practice perspective can create particular research methods, can bring particular aspects into a scholar's research. And yes, so her talk today, Rereading Beowulf and Gawain as a Writer, Reflections on Creative Practice as a Research Method. And now, without further ado, I will give over to Irina. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Judith, and thank you, Thais and Elise and Fatima, for welcoming me here. I'm very happy to speak to you all, especially on a Friday afternoon. At least for some of us, it's already the afternoon. So thank you for being here. I'm going to do something a little unusual today. It's not a way I've done a presentation before. In that, I want to make this a little more conversational, and while I will speak and then we can have discussion afterwards, I haven't made it a formal talk. And the other thing that's unusual is that I'm going to present some ideas that are very much works in progress, and really, I would say, at an early stage of the research. And so, you know, they're presented to you in the spirit of exploration, of sort of showing you where I am right now with the work, and to give you a sense of the relationship between creative and scholarly. But of course, I welcome tips, or if you think it's totally crazy, one of the ideas you hear might be a little bit wacky. You know, well, what's the line from Spinal Tap? It's such a fine line between brilliant and stupid, really. You know, this is a feeling that I walk with a great deal when I research. Many of you have your cameras on. I really love that. I love to see a few faces as I speak. So thank you very much. Okay, here's going to be the shape. Here's going to be the shape of it. I want to talk a little bit about my creative writing and how I got started in it, and its changing relationship to my scholarship, because I think sometimes from the outside, a writing career can seem like a bit of a monolith, but actually for me, it's been quite varied over the years. I want to describe briefly the project I'm working on right now, which Judith mentioned briefly. It's a very long-term book project. And then I want to talk about how my work towards this book project has sort of sprouted little ideas that I can actually only pursue in scholarship, that I can't pursue in the creative space. And I think that's also important because as much as creative or so-called public humanities work or public writing, I hate the term public writing, but the term public writing has become much more popular. I do think it's important to hold on to the fact that there are kinds of work and types of inquiry that actually really make sense in a scholarly language and in a scholarly setting. And I think that's wonderful that we have that. So that's going to be the general outline. I'm going to try not to speak for too long so we have time to talk afterwards on any and all of this. Okay. How did I get started in creative writing? I got started quite secretly. and oddly, it actually began with a trip to the New Braunfels Sausage Festival in southern Texas, the annual Salute to Sausage, which I wrote about for the Southwest Review, which was then edited by my colleague Willard Spiegelman at Southern Methodist University. He said, if you write about it, I'll publish it in the Southwest Review. I had no idea what that meant, but I bought a dirndl and had it fitted and got in the car and drove down to the hill country and ate some sausage and wrote about it. And for a while, I kept that, it wasn't secret, but it was on the down low because I was tenure track and because it had been communicated to me from a few angles that I should not look like I was distracted in any way from scholarship on the tenure track. And so I left it off of my CV, for example. I didn't put that kind of thing on my CV. Although it brought me a great deal of pleasure. Also, for a number of years, I did not ever write anything creative or public that had anything to do with medieval literature. These were, I would say, up until around 2017 or 2018. So I've been writing already for at least half a decade. I was writing about food, I was writing about culture, I had started writing memoir, but I was not writing anything that would look like public humanities. And it was really, I think, an editor for Aeon who invited me to write something on the topic of my monograph that prompted me to write the first thing for the general public about my research. So that model where, you have your research that you work on and then you translate it to the general public has not been the model for most of my career or most of my writing. What I think brought the two lives closer together was partly teaching, because the people who read my creative work were my students, and they would ask me about it. And sometimes they asked me, you write about food, why don't you teach something to do with food? So I taught a course on medieval food, or, it would come from their interest. And partly book reviews, which I also started to do about 4 or 5 years ago, and where a lot of editors want someone with expertise in the area to review the relevant book, even if it's for a general audience. And so I wound up starting to write quite a bit for a more larger public on medieval topics, right? But not in the sort of specialized or focused way that I would act as a scholar. So I think it still had a difference. So now I would say the two are quite intertwined. The two lives, the two careers, the two practices, and they really, I have my teaching influence right now. Often I will teach something and then I'll get a column idea from that, and I'll go write the column, or maybe something that I've read because an editor wanted me to review it then influences how I teach, or what I'm thinking about in a scholarly way. I will also say, quite pragmatically, in 2020, when we all went on lockdown, I was also chair for the first time, and I had a child at home. Since then, I have not published an enormous amount of new scholarly work for reasons that I think you can all understand and maybe forgive me for. Things have come out that were in progress before that, but I've done papers, but I haven't, brought things to fruition. And so the creative work really became a little bit of a lifeline in that period, because I could do smaller pieces and I could be reading towards topics that I was interested in and write a review or a short piece and keep that part of my life alive. Whereas I think if I had been chair with a kid at home full time and everything that was involved at that time, and been trying to work on a monograph or an article for a demanding peer-reviewed journal, I don't think I would have gotten anything done whatsoever, just quite frankly. So that's the pragmatic element. The creative project I have been working on, which Judith mentioned, and which I mentioned earlier too, began actually completely separate from medieval literature. I'm a perfectionist. I have long had an interest in perfection and imperfection. And for a long time, I wanted to write a book on basically kind of praise of imperfection. And I wanted to look at all kinds of different parts of life and all sorts of cultural moments where imperfection turns out to have a certain value. It wasn't going to be limited to my area of expertise whatsoever. In nonfiction, what sometimes happens, nonfiction is unlike fiction. Forgive me if I'm telling you something you already know, but in case you don't, you're sort of new to the general publishing world, novelists have to fight very hard to get an agent. That's not as true for nonfiction writers. Agents seek out nonfiction writers and approach them. That's what happened to me, and I signed with an agent. That's a long story too, because that was over 5 years ago and there's not a book yet. But we went through all kinds of drafts of material and so on as the project changed over the years. It was actually a question from my agent that made me reshape, my former agent that made me reshape the project. And that question was, what would medieval people have to say about imperfection? And I remember because I was sitting across from her in New York and I thought, I don't know, this project has nothing to do with the Middle Ages. This is my writing self. The medieval self is a completely different self. What are we talking about? And a week later, I was walking through Bonn and I started to, it was almost like the texts were dropping in my head in front of me. I was in the marketplace and I could barely walk because I had, Julian of Norwich and Abelard and Marjorie Kemp and all of these figures just coming into my head. And I realized, in fact, to some extent, I had been writing about this topic all along. All of my work in some way had to do with imperfection, although I hadn't called it that in most of the scholarly work I did. But my monograph is on the role of difficult emotions in teaching and learning. Almost everything I did had to do with imperfection. So it made sense then to think about changing it and bringing in medieval literature. Although from the agent's point of view, I think that was a very pragmatic business consideration, but it also made sense organically to me. I struggled a great deal to find a way to combine those two. This did not come naturally to me. And I realized this is partly because when I would write about medieval literature, a kind of scholarly instinct would kick in. And it was an instinct to write from a place of authority, not to write from a place of exploration or discovery. It was an instinct, it was actually, I would say, it was a fear-based reaction. I think, in scholarly writing, often I don't want to speak for everyone, but my experience of scholarly writing has been that it's like building a citadel. You try to build a castle that's impenetrable. And if no one can come in and no one can understand what you're saying, that's fine, as long as they can't poke a hole in the wall. I think that's the extreme version, but I do think that when a lot of my scholarship has been written with a voice in the back of my head saying, what's something reader A or reader B could say about this? What are the holes that could be poked into this argument? How do I defend myself against that attack? My experience of creative writing in essays and in memoir, and even to some extent in book reviews, is that it's looser, it's more exploratory, it's more driven by curiosity, it's often more dreamy, depending on which genre I'm writing in. I compare it to a garden in the sense that people are invited to come in and sort of make their own sense out of my writing. Like a garden, it means someone might smell the roses and find them wonderful. It might also mean someone might piss on the flower beds. All of these things are possible. It's a much more vulnerable kind of writing. And so I found it extremely difficult to combine these two modes in the writing process together. And I want to say I solved the problem, but in fact, I didn't solve the problem. Elizabeth Boyle solved the problem. I read her book, Fierce Appetites, and she just didn't worry about it. She just combined things, I was sitting there worrying, can I say these things about medieval literature without giving the full context and without explaining everything and without going into the language and how the language is different? I was still thinking like a scholar. And she just did it. She did it in a very casual way. She didn't explain why she was bringing in the medieval into her book. She just has memoir and she has medieval material, and the reader is invited to make sense of them together. And so that was wonderful for me to reading her book, and the is really her insight that helped me, where I realized I didn't have to make so many apologies. I could just put the two together and see what happens. Okay, this was a long process, as I mentioned, and along the way, there have been a number of chapters I've written. I've written an entire book proposal that's gone nowhere. I have another book proposal that hopefully will go somewhere. But I think what's been interesting about it, although it's quite difficult, and there's been I would say, a really substantial amount of failure that I've had to deal with, and this is in the spirit of conversation and openness. Some of what was a failure in terms of the creative writing was still helpful for my reading of the medieval texts as a teacher and as a scholar. And so that's been a little bit interesting to see that there's a payoff, that, I am still the same person when I'm doing, no matter what kind of writing I'm doing. And that interchange and that cross-pollination is always there, no matter what. So, okay, I want to talk about two examples of this. One of them I will just describe. The other one, I have a few little PowerPoints for you. My caveat is that these are both, as I described, they're not my main focus right now. They're topics that have arisen out of the creative work, and I'm gathering material and sort of building the argument very slowly in my notes, rather than, I'm not very far along on either of these. So I don't make any claims to originality. It's quite possible that with both of these arguments, one of you will put up your hand and say, this is who's already done it. I've done preliminary bibliographical searches, but not the full workup. What I can claim, though, is neither of these approaches was standard to the way I have been taught to read the text, or I have been accustomed to read the text. So in both cases, my writing creatively about a text helped me to escape the patterns of my own thinking about it. So I think that's the precision I would make. Okay, the first one was Gawain, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. In a previous incarnation of the project that I'm working on right now, I had sort of gone through and tried different balances of medieval and memoir. And I had done a version of a chapter which was a lot of memoir and little bits of medieval to illustrate. And my agent was unhappy with it. And then when I looked at it after some time, I realized I wasn't terribly happy with it either. It was kind of glib and superficial. Then I decided to go back to the drawing board, and I decided to remove myself quite a bit from the equation and to see what would happen if I retold the story of Gawain, but in a sort of accessible literary way, something like what Neil Gaiman does with the Icelandic myths, just a kind of retelling, but with my own sense of what the poem is saying about perfectionism, about imperfection, and so on. And it was, again, I wasn't writing an argument. I was really exploring the text and paying attention to it in the slightly dreamy state that often for me is connected to writing creatively or writing memoir. I had also just taught it. I had taught it in a course where we read it very, very slowly over the course of a semester. So it was quite fresh for me. And what I did early on in retelling the story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight was to say, what if I called the author a she? Of course, we all know that the author, the Pearl poet or the Gawain poet, is a he, because just about every book says so and refers to the poet as a he. So far, I haven't seen really conclusive proof that it was a man. It's an assumption. It's an assumption that's repeated. Every now and then one scholar says, well, we don't really know, but it seems likely that it's a he. Okay, fine, but we don't know. We don't actually know. Would I have allowed myself that freedom writing scholarship? I wouldn't even have thought of it. I would have just accepted what was in front of me. The authorities say it's a he, so I will call the Gawain poet a he. But in this kind of playful way, I thought, why not? I could just call the Gawain poet a she. What happened then, however, was that I started noticing different things in the poem, simply because I was looking at the text closely and writing about it with this idea that it was a woman writing. And specifically, I got stuck on the hunting scenes because I thought, why have these very brutal scenes of bodies being torn apart paralleled or intertwined, interlaced with the bedroom scenes, the very, genteel kind of indoor, safe bedroom scenes in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And then it occurred to me, something which feels like it should be absolutely obvious. I have not yet found it in literature. Maybe it is somewhere. That, of course, if you are someone who can become pregnant in the Middle Ages, then the space in which you have sex and potentially in which you give birth is a space that is associated with the possibility that your body might be torn apart and that you might die. And of course, there is work on Gawain being feminized in those scenes, maybe even, being on the passive end of a sexual relationship, maybe even, being violated by Lady Bertilac. But I started to think that what's actually happening in those scenes is that sex is starting to mean the same thing for Gawain as it does for any woman of childbearing years or a childbearing age in his period. Namely, that sex is not just sex and the emotions and the power issues associated with it, but that it can lead directly to his death. And I think he knows in those scenes that sex can lead to his death, just in a different way. He's in the female position, but not in the female sexual position, in the female reproductive position. And then I started to pay attention to the girdle, which there's been a lot written about the magical girdle he receives from Lady Bertilac, which he decides to keep. So far, I have not seen it connected to one of the types of girdles which we do have from the Middle Ages, namely birth girdles. We still have birthing girdles, which were meant to give women a magical or supernatural protection when they were giving birth, when they were pregnant and giving birth. And, you have everything in the scholarship discussed with Gawain about, various kinds of medieval magic and so on, and other texts, what have you, magical girdles in medieval romance. But so far, I have not found what seems to me the most obvious, which is that he's in a bedroom. He is worried about having sex. He is going to go to a chapel in the wilderness that scholars agree recalls female genitalia, right? Doesn't it make sense that at least one association of the girdle would be a birth girdle? Or that at least, even if we assume a male author, at least some of the audience of that poem would have thought of that in a very obvious way. I started thinking about other things, like the fact that Mary, who is inside of Gawain's shield, of course, is also a protector of pregnant women in childbirth. I started thinking about the fact that the poem has one authorial figure in it, and that is a woman who is hidden in plain sight, and that's Morgan Le Fay. Morgan Le Fay, if you think about it, is actually the author inside the poem. I started noticing things like, just as one further example, but I have other notes, in the first continuation of Chrétien de Troyes' Perceval, Gawain is clad at one point, and he's clad in a helmet that's fit for Solomon. So we sort of see the relationship there to the Solomonic pentangle, which is on his shield. And he has a sword that, quote, that any woman in labor, even if her life hung in the balance, would be delivered of her child at once if struck on the head with the flat of the naked blade, right? So there I find little associations in other texts of Gawain and safe childbirth. There's a point where he wants to be protected from Bale and Bronde, or from knife, right? From Beowulf, from brawn or knife, but why a knife? He's going to have his head chopped off with an axe, unless we're also thinking about other kinds of danger to the body, which would involve cutting open, like a cesarean, for example. So, I mean, that's where I am with this particular approach. Again, in the end, I think when I write it up, I will probably use it to question what it means to imagine a gendered author anyway, right? I actually don't think, I think it's a bit simplistic to imagine either a male author and to assume we know what that means, or a female author and to assume we know what that means. But playing this game of calling the author a she, as I wrote, opened up different things for me. It unfolded the poem in a different way for me that I personally, and I'm sure there are feminist scholars who have already been there, I personally would not have seen had I not been writing in this different mode, in which is not as defensive, and also to an extent not as orientated towards established authority. That's one. Example number two is from, I should say, and that chapter, my agent didn't like it. And in the end, I realized it wouldn't work either, but I'm still very happy to have written it because I learned a lot about Gawain writing that chapter, writing about him, that poem in a creative way. The next chapter is one that I have held on to. It's a chapter that's about my father, it's meant for the book. And it's also about Beowulf. And in this chapter, I want to explore the kinds of stories men who are great or men who would like to see themselves as great tell them about themselves. And the way a certain kind of perfectionism, maybe even a certain kind of narcissistic perfectionism, can destroy a community. And that's the memoir element. I was also reading at the time when I wrote this chapter, I was reading about some psychological work about perfectionism and its connection to anxiety and its connection to various family structures. And so I was also rereading Beowulf with a view to the fathers, which again, has been done before. I think Erin Shaw has an article on it and a dissertation on fathers in medieval literature. So it's certainly been noticed that fatherlessness is a major theme in Beowulf. What came out to me while writing this, and it was a different kind of chapter, so I wasn't going as deep into Beowulf, but I think what I noticed, which certainly other scholars have noticed already, is the amount of fear there is in the poem. And, Michael Lapidge has written about terror in Beowulf and the vocabulary of terror, broga, ejesa, grure. But I became interested in the words karu and charu, that word, which is often most frequently translated as care, but I think is a bit more complicated. And how, in many translations, it is translated as care, but it's a word which has other potentials for translation. Here come the PowerPoints. We're going to do this quickly because I just want to give you the sort of the nutshell version of it. Okay. So, Latin cura, the cognate can be trouble, physical or mental. Solicitude, which I think is how we often use care today. Attention, pains, anxiety, concern, disquiet, trouble, grief, sorrow. And we see a lot of these in the Old English cognate as well. Beowulf has charian, to sorrow, be anxious or troubled, to take care. Notice anxious, be anxious. Show concern for, care about. Beowulf also has charu, or sometimes in other versions, karu. Again, similar ideas, sorrow, care, anxiety, but often solicitude, right? Taking care. And Beowulf has quite, as I'm sure many of you have noticed, has quite a few word compounds involving this word. Chersyth, maybe a sorrowful fate. I've given you Bosworth-Toller and Dictionary of Old English where it's available. Chadwelm, kind of an odd word, some kind of agitating emotion, which may be sorrow, maybe anxiety. Eldor charu, life care, maybe careful, worry about one's life. One could say. Guth charu, the stress of battle, grievous strife, who knows? Mal charu, some kind of negative emotion connected to a particular time. Mo charu, a little easier. And sorg charu, also a little easier because it has the sorrow in it, but having some kind of anxiety or sorrow. It's interesting to me that both Bosworth-Toller and the Dictionary of Old English have anxiety in some as one of the options in quite a number of these. So that's been present all along. I did a big spreadsheet. I'm not going to show you the full spreadsheet, but what my impressions so far in terms of where I am in this work is that Beowulf editors and translators tend to avoid the possibility of anxiety, even where it would make sense. And there is a lot of terror. There is a lot of fear. There's fear right at the beginning. Chafing terrifies the earls, right, around him. The poem starts with fear and the poem ends with fear. So I think it's fair to say it is a poem that is in profound ways about mortal fear. And yet I wonder about this tendency to translate charu compounds in ways that really don't sound good in English, that don't necessarily make a lot of sense in modern English or in the situations where they come up, and where maybe anxiety would be a better option. Heaney being an exception to this in many ways. So just two examples very quickly, and then we can all chat. Aldorciare is used once for the negative feelings that Heremod causes among his people. I think we all remember he's an evil king. I've repeated the dictionary definitions, and here are some of the glosses from editions of Beowulf. Kleber, life care, great sorrow. What is life care? Okay. Mitchell Robinson, a cause of anxiety for one's life. That makes sense, I think. Wren Bolton, mortal sorrow, great grief. Wyatt Chambers, life care again. Some translations. Kennedy, his life was a lingering woe. That suggests a sort of the unpleasantness or sorrow or grief. Chickering, a lifetime sorrow. Layutza, the surging of cares. Heaney, a source of anxiety. I guess all I want to say here is I think a source of anxiety probably makes a lot of sense for Heremod, given that he is killing his companions, right? I think that should be probably a primary translation for that situation, for that version of Aldorciare, that people are scared for their lives. But there has been a tendency to go towards other options for charu, probably also because of the modern cognate, right, of care. It seems to be a natural translation. One of the instances of charu in line 1303 is used for the emotion that is renewed when Grendel's mother attacks Heorot, as you remember. Again, I think as you see, one of the editions offers anxiety as an option in the glossary. The other, it's weird because I don't know what they mean by care when they say care. Do they mean solicitude? Do they mean grief? Do they mean sorrow? Do they mean anxiety? It's a vague word even in, or polyvalent word even in modern English. But anxiety is only comes up in one of the editions that I looked at. And then we have various translations. Kennedy's care was renewed. Chickering, then grief was renewed. Again, care was renewed, and then Heaney's more poetic, it was a fresh blow. And there, I think, particularly in this situation, Grendel's mother, this is a group of people who thought they could be safe, and now another monster is attacking them. Is it their solicitude that is renewed? Well, probably not, because they probably have that all along. I'm not sure if grief is renewed. The grief might be added to because they've lost another person. But I'm not sure that grief renews itself, of course, but it doesn't make an enormous amount of sense. I think their fear was renewed. I think their anxiety was renewed because they had been attacked again. They thought they could be safe and were attacked again. So that's again, another small glimpse into work in progress, much more already there in terms of work that's already been done by other scholars in the field. Again, I use this as a way to trace a line of curiosity and inquiry that I wouldn't have come across had I not been writing in a different mode. And I think, just to sum up quickly before, to make sure we have time to talk as well, I think what this process has made me aware of is how much when I am writing in a scholarly language, I tend to be much more automatically accepting of previous authorities, of previous scholarship. And there's a way in which writing in a creative mode, even though I do try to be responsible, I try not to, not to say things I think are inaccurate, even in creative works. It gives me a certain kind of freedom. Maybe it's the exploratory aspect of it too, to look at texts I think I know well from in a different way. And then the final point I would mention was one I talked about at the beginning, which is both of these sort of lines of inquiry are not lines of inquiry I can write in a book for a general audience. It doesn't make sense. I couldn't do, this kind of research and then pursue it in the way that I hope to do for a very large audience. It doesn't fit into the genres that are aimed in that way. And so I do think, as much as I value creative types of writing and creative ways of engaging with text, and they are very important to me and increasingly important to me, I also think there needs to be a space just for good old-fashioned scholarship where you can look at the language and the words and the historical context and follow the arguments really step by step in a careful way, and maybe even build that citadel as a scholar, because some questions are really, I think, interesting for scholars and interesting for students, but not necessarily interesting for a mass market, and that's quite okay. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Irina, for a really fascinating talk. And I'm sure there will be lots of questions. They're the first, a lot of hands raised already.